Oh, beloved, let me tell you something tonight. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with words, but with silence. There are moments when you are ready to defend yourself, ready to prove your point, ready to show the world that you are right. Yet the Spirit of God whispers, stay silent. It's not weakness, it's not fear, it's obedience. When God says to stay silent, it means He is already speaking on your behalf in realms you cannot see. It means He is working behind the curtain, arranging the pieces, shifting hearts, and moving mountains that your words could never move. Silence in the hands of God is not empty, it is powerful. And while people may mistake your quietness for surrender, heaven knows it is strategy, because sometimes the loudest testimony you'll ever give is not in what you say, but in what you refuse to say. And if you let Him, God will turn your silence into a sound that shakes the earth. Silence is God's strategy, not your defeat. And that truth shakes the very foundation of how we see our struggles. Too often, when people misunderstand us, when lies are spoken, or when our character is questioned, our natural instinct is to rise up, defend ourselves, and prove everyone wrong. We equate silence with weakness, with submission, with the idea that we've been defeated. But in God's kingdom, silence is not the absence of power, it is the evidence of trust. Silence becomes the posture of a heart that knows God has already gone ahead, and the battle has already been shifted into His hands. When God instructs His children to remain silent, it is not because He wants you powerless, it is because He wants to display His power without your interference, you see. When we speak too quickly, when we argue and push, we often contaminate the very victory God is preparing for us. But silence is the divine pause that allows heaven to move without human interruption. When you think about the story of the Israelites walking around the walls of Jericho, God gave them a strategy that made no sense in the natural. He told them to march in silence for 6 days, to walk around those walls without shouting, without announcing, without defending their presence. In the eyes of the enemy, it must have looked like foolishness. Imagine soldiers, warriors, priests, all walking quietly around massive walls day after day, not lifting their voices. Yet in the silence, God was working a strategy. In the silence, He was teaching them to trust that His way was greater than their instincts. And when the 7th day came, and their shout was finally released, the walls collapsed. That is what silence does. It stores up the power of your obedience until God determines the right moment for release. Silence is not about ignoring what's happening. It doesn't mean you don't feel the sting of accusation or the weight of misunderstanding. It doesn't mean you don't have the words to respond. It means you choose not to fight a battle that isn't yours to fight. Silence says, I trust God more than I trust myself. Silence declares that God is the one who justifies. God is the one who vindicates. God is the one who makes every crooked path straight. When you hold your peace, you are declaring with your life that vengeance is not yours. It belongs to the Lord. And when you step back, God steps in with strategies no man can stand against. Think about Jesus as He stood before Pilate, falsely accused, ridiculed and mocked. The Son of God, with all authority in His mouth to silence every enemy, chose silence. He did not defend Himself. He did not argue His case. Why? Because He knew the cross was His purpose, and no amount of arguing could stop the plan of God. His silence was not defeat. It was destiny. It was the strategy of heaven unfolding in a way the world could not comprehend. In that same way, there are times when your silence looks like loss, but in reality, it is the evidence that God is carrying out a greater purpose. When God tells you to stay silent, He is asking you to surrender control. He is asking you to allow Him to be your defender. The silence you endure becomes a weapon of warfare. It confuses the enemy who expects you to fight back. It humbles those who watch, wondering why you don't retaliate. And it positions you for God's hand to move in such a way that there is no question who brought the victory. That is why silence is never defeat. It is the hidden strategy of heaven that turns the battle in your favor. Staying silent allows God's voice to speak louder than yours, because in the stillness of holding your tongue, His power and authority are magnified above human noise. When you choose not to defend yourself, when you decide not to retaliate or lash out, you are essentially stepping aside and making space for God to take center stage. Too often our words drown out his voice, our arguments cloud his clarity, and our explanations interfere with his divine plan. Silence becomes the vessel that amplifies heaven's sound. It is like turning down the volume on human opinion so that the whispers of God can be heard more clearly, not only by you, but by those watching your life. God's voice is not always thunderous. Sometimes he speaks in whispers, in quiet confirmations, in subtle movements that require sensitivity. If we are constantly filling the air with our words, our rebuttals, our need to be understood, we may miss the very sound of his direction. That is why the book of Ecclesiastes reminds us there is a time to keep silent and a time to speak. There are moments when silence is not a lack of response, but a divine choice to let God speak for you. It is in those moments that his voice echoes louder than anything you could have said. Think of Moses standing before the Red Sea with the Egyptian army pressing behind. The people cried out in fear, but Moses declared, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Their stillness, their silence, became the stage for God's mighty deliverance. No argument, no reasoning, no speech could have parted the sea. Only the voice and power of God could accomplish that miracle. And it happened when his people surrendered their urge to fight with words and instead chose to trust his voice. Sometimes when people slander you, when false accusations rise, your first instinct is to craft a response, to defend every detail, to prove your innocence. But what if your silence allowed God's truth to rise above every lie? What if your quiet trust was the very thing that opened the door for his vindication? When you remain silent, the voice of the Lord becomes undeniable. He speaks in ways no human argument can counter, through outcomes, through changed hearts, through supernatural turnarounds. What your words fail to accomplish, his voice declares with authority. Jesus himself modeled this truth. When he stood accused by the chief priests and elders, the scriptures tell us he gave no answer. Pilate even asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" Yet Jesus remained silent. Why? Because he knew that the Father's voice would speak louder than anything he could say. His silence allowed the prophecy of Isaiah to be fulfilled, that, like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. His silence was not absence. It was alignment with heaven's voice, and that silence became the loudest declaration of all the cross, the resurrection, the redemption of mankind. When you allow God's voice to be louder than yours, you are surrendering your need to be right in order to let his truth prevail. You are trusting that his ways are higher, his perspective is eternal, and his timing is perfect. It may look to others like you have no defense, but in reality you have the greatest defender of all. God does not need your arguments to prove who you are. He needs your obedience to step aside so his voice can thunder on your behalf. Staying silent, then, is not passive, it is active faith. It is saying, "Lord, I will not compete with your voice. I will let you speak louder than me." And in that surrender, you witness him do what no amount of human reasoning could ever achieve. Silence protects you from battles not meant for you, because not every conflict is yours to fight, and not every attack deserves your response. Sometimes the greatest wisdom is not found in the sharpness of your tongue, but in the restraint of your spirit. The enemy thrives on distraction, luring you into arguments, petty disputes, and emotional entanglements that steal your peace and drain your strength. When you remain silent, you are refusing to waste energy on battles that are beneath your assignment. You are declaring that your focus is too valuable to be squandered on proving a point or winning an argument. Silence shields your purpose from unnecessary wounds, because responding to every voice that rises against you will only tether you to struggles God never designed for you to carry. There are people who will provoke you intentionally, who will bait you into conversations designed to pull you out of character. There will be situations that seem to demand your response, but discernment will show you that silence is your best weapon. Just because someone calls you to battle doesn't mean you are required to show up. Silence becomes your armor, your invisible shield, protecting you from getting caught in traps that were never meant to define you. Think of David when Shimei hurled curses at him as he fled from Absalom. David could have silenced him with a word, could have defended his honor, but instead he chose to endure in silence, recognizing that not every insult required retaliation. That restraint positioned him for God's vindication and protection. When you take on battles that aren't yours, you risk stepping out of alignment with God's will. He never intended for you to spend your energy fighting with people, defending your reputation, or proving your worth. Your energy is meant for your calling, your assignment, your destiny. Silence becomes a protective wall that keeps you aligned with what matters most. It guards your heart from bitterness, your spirit from unnecessary anger, and your mind from endless cycles of overthinking. Every word you choose not to say is a seed of peace planted in your future. The enemy knows he cannot always stop your destiny, but he will try to delay it by pulling you into battles that waste your time. If he can keep you distracted, exhausted, and constantly defending yourself, then he knows your progress toward your purpose will slow down. That is why silence is such a powerful act of warfare. It denies the enemy the satisfaction of your engagement. It frustrates his schemes because he cannot fight with someone who refuses to play his game. Silence says, I am not going to waste my time fighting shadows when I am called to walk in the light. Even Jesus understood the power of silence in protecting his mission. When others sought to trap him with questions, hoping to twist his words, there were moments when he answered with silence. He knew that not every provocation was worth addressing, that some attempts to entangle him were simply distractions. His silence protected his mission and ensured that he remained focused on the cross. In the same way, your silence preserves your assignment, keeping you from being pulled into detours that would only delay your destiny. When you choose silence, you are not ignoring the battle. You are acknowledging that it is not yours. You are releasing the need to control the narrative and entrusting it to God. Silence protects your peace, your focus, and your calling. It prevents you from lowering yourself to fights that do not align with the greatness inside you. In silence, you remain elevated, seated in the authority of knowing who you are and whose you are. And while others may think your silence is surrender, in truth, it is your shield, guarding you from battles that were never written into your story. In silence, God shifts hearts and circumstances unseen, because while you may feel overlooked in your quietness, heaven is working tirelessly on your behalf. Silence is not inactivity. It is trust in divine activity. When you hold your tongue and step back from trying to force outcomes, you give God permission to move in ways your words never could. Behind closed doors in unseen places, He is orchestrating change, softening hearts, aligning opportunities, and redirecting situations to work together for your good. Silence becomes the seedbed where miracles are cultivated, because it is in the stillness that God's unseen hand is most effective. When you attempt to manipulate circumstances with arguments, explanations, or pressure, you often interfere with the slow, steady process God is working out. But when you remain silent, you allow Him to do the hard work that no speech could accomplish. Think about Joseph, falsely accused, misunderstood, and thrown into prison. He could have fought back, raised his voice, tried to clear his name, but he remained quiet and endured. During that time of silence, God was shifting circumstances in Pharaoh's palace, preparing the cupbearer to remember him, positioning the dream that only Joseph could interpret, and aligning an entire nation's survival with Joseph's destiny. His silence didn't mean God had forgotten him. It meant God was moving pieces Joseph could not see. The power of silence is that it trusts God to handle what is hidden. Hearts are changed because you argued your way into being heard, but because God touched what you could not reach. Circumstances turn in your favor not because you convinced someone to help you, but because God stirred compassion in their spirit. In silence, He works in the minds of those who oppose you. He whispers to the conscience of those who wronged you, and He plants conviction where there was once resistance. The same people who once dismissed you may find themselves drawn to bless you, not because you spoke, but because God shifted their hearts. When the Israelites were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, they had no voice powerful enough to convince Pharaoh to back down. They had no argument strong enough to command the sea to part. All they could do was stand still and be silent while God shifted the impossible. Their silence allowed the miraculous to manifest, and the waters obeyed the voice of the Creator. What no human reasoning could change, God's unseen authority transformed. That is the mystery of silence. It looks like passivity on the outside, but in reality, it is the deepest expression of faith in God's unseen work. Even in your personal relationships, silence is often the place where God works best. Instead of trying to change people with constant words, you allow Him to reach into places you cannot. You cannot shift the hidden motives of the heart, but He can. You cannot alter the deep wounds that make someone resist you, but He can. Silence says, Lord, I trust you to handle what I cannot see and change what I cannot touch. And in that trust, you position yourself for outcomes greater than you imagined. Silence also allows circumstances to ripen in God's timing. Sometimes you are ready for resolution, ready for closure, ready for the answer, but the situation has not matured yet. If God gave it to you too soon, it would not carry the full blessing He intends. In your silence, He is arranging events in the right order, ensuring that everything falls into place exactly when it should. What feels like delay is often divine preparation. And what looks like nothing happening is really everything aligning. In silence, you are hidden, but you are not forgotten. The unseen realm is alive with God's movements, shifting atmospheres, aligning opportunities, and preparing breakthroughs. Your silence creates the space for Him to do what only He can do, change hearts and circumstances beyond your reach. And when the time is right, the evidence of His unseen work will be undeniable, showing the world that your silence was never empty but filled with divine strategy. Silence develops spiritual strength and self-control because it takes far more power to hold your tongue than it does to release it. Anyone can react, anyone can lash out, anyone can defend themselves when emotions are running high, but it requires discipline and spiritual maturity to remain quiet when everything in you wants to speak. Silence is the training ground of your spirit, the place where God shapes your character and teaches you mastery over your impulses. It is in those moments of restraint that you discover how strong you truly are, because real strength is not in loudness, but in the ability to stand firm without saying a word. When you are silent in the face of accusation, mockery, or misunderstanding, you are exercising spiritual muscles that grow stronger with every act of restraint. Just like physical strength requires resistance training, spiritual strength is built in the resistance of silence. The urge to speak, to retaliate, to prove yourself, it all presses against you, but choosing silence is what builds the endurance of your faith. You begin to realize that you do not need to fight every battle with your mouth, because God has already armed you with patience, wisdom, and the quiet assurance of His presence. Self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit, and silence is one of its greatest demonstrations. To remain quiet when everything within you is screaming to respond is not weakness. It is a display of the Spirit's work in your life. It shows that you are no longer governed by the flesh, but by the Spirit of God who teaches you to be still. Silence becomes proof that you are maturing in Christ, that you no longer need validation from people because you have confidence in who you are in Him. It is a sign that you are growing into the image of Jesus, who Himself often chose silence over reaction. Think about Jesus before His accusers. He had every reason to respond, every right to defend Himself, but He chose silence. That silence was not a lack of strength. It was the highest form of strength. He had complete control over His emotions, His words, and His response. That kind of restraint doesn't come from human willpower alone. It comes from being rooted in the will of God. When you choose silence, you are declaring that your identity is not shaken by what others say or think. You are affirming that your stability comes from God, not from the approval or acceptance of man. Silence also teaches you the discipline of patience. It slows down the pace of your reactions and gives God room to work in your heart. In moments of silence, He refines your thoughts, purifies your intentions, and aligns your responses with His wisdom. Instead of speaking in anger, you learn to wait until the Spirit gives you words seasoned with grace. Instead of acting on impulse, you develop the strength to hold back until the right time. This patience becomes a safeguard, protecting you from regret and guiding you into decisions that honor God. Over time, silence transforms you from the inside out. It trains your spirit to trust God more deeply, to rely less on your ability to explain and more on His ability to defend. It strengthens your capacity to endure hardship without bitterness, to face misunderstanding without losing your peace, and to walk through trials without losing your identity. That kind of strength cannot be faked. It is cultivated through repeated choices to remain silent when speaking would have been easier. The enemy wants you reactive because reactivity leads to regret. But God wants you strong, steady, and spirit-led. Every time you choose silence, you are declaring victory over your flesh. Every time you resist the urge to fight with words, you are proving that your spirit is stronger than your impulses. Silence is the sacred discipline that sharpens your character, anchors your soul, and builds within you a reservoir of strength that cannot be shaken. It is through silence that God matures you, teaching you to walk not by what you feel, but by the power of His Spirit. God uses your silence as a testimony of trust in Him, because when you hold back your words and choose not to defend yourself, the world sees a picture of faith that speaks louder than anything you could have said. Silence in the believer's life is not emptiness. It is evidence that you believe God is faithful enough to fight for you, that His timing is perfect, and that His justice will prevail. People around you may not understand why you refuse to argue, why you don't try to clear your name, why you don't respond to the negativity aimed at you, but what they are witnessing is your silent declaration. My God is enough. Every moment you choose silence, you are preaching without opening your mouth. You are demonstrating that your confidence rests not in your ability to persuade, but in God's ability to vindicate. Your silence tells a story that words cannot capture. It says that you trust God's character even when the situation is unfair. It says that you trust His justice even when others misunderstand you. It says that you trust His plan even when the outcome is not yet visible. This kind of testimony carries a weight that arguments never could, because silence shifts the focus from you to God. When people see that you don't retaliate, that you don't lash out, that you don't lower yourself to the level of your accusers, they begin to recognize that something greater is at work in you. Your silence becomes the evidence of a faith that cannot be shaken by circumstances. Think of Daniel in the lion's den. He didn't argue his case before the king. He didn't fight against the decree. He simply trusted God in silence. That silence testified to everyone watching that his faith was greater than his fear. When God shut the mouths of the lions, it was not only a miracle, but also a declaration to the entire kingdom that Daniel's God was real. His silence in the face of danger became a testimony that echoed louder than any words could have. In the same way, when you remain silent, trusting God to deliver, your life becomes a sermon others can see and be inspired by. Silence also testifies to your spiritual maturity. In a culture that glorifies loudness, arguments, and the need to prove yourself, choosing silence stands as radical faith. It shows that you are anchored in God's approval rather than man's applause. It declares that you don't need to shout to be heard, because heaven itself is speaking for you. This kind of testimony doesn't just impact those closest to you. It ripples outward, inspiring others to trust God more deeply in their own lives. When people watch you respond with silence instead of retaliation, they are confronted with the reality that faith changes how a person lives. Your silence also testifies to the enemy. Every time you refuse to react, every time you stay still when provoked, you are reminding the enemy that he cannot control you. Your silence tells him that your trust in God outweighs his attempts to shake you. It becomes a declaration of victory, not in what you say, but in what you refuse to say. The enemy thrives on chaos, but your silence testifies to the peace of God reigning within you. That peace itself is a sermon, a witness that God is truly at work. Even in your personal trials, silence can testify to future generations. When your children, your family, or your friends see how you endured with quiet trust, they learn what it means to walk by faith. Your silence becomes part of your legacy, showing others that true strength is not found in shouting but in surrender. The testimony of your silence will echo long after the moment passes, reminding everyone that God always honors those who trust Him enough to stay still. God does not waste your silence. He transforms it into a message that others can see, feel, and remember. Your silence testifies of His faithfulness, His justice, and His power. It tells the story that your life belongs to Him, that your trust is anchored in Him, and that your faith is stronger than any storm or accusation. In the quietness of your silence, the loudest testimony is heard that you belong to a God who fights your battles, carries your burdens, and always brings victory in His time.